What will 100 years of climate change do to Britain? Well, one thing it won't do is this. This image shown in the London Futures Climate Change exhibition 3 years ago, and I have to thank its creators, Robert Graves and Didier Maddock-Jones, for giving me a useful device for making some, what I believe are important points, is unrealistic, I think, in several different ways. Firstly, the buildings look kind of like they do now, which implies that this future isn't very far away, and therefore implying that sea levels might rise by several meters in a matter of decades. That's not going to happen, though they might well rise by a meter or even more by the end of the century. Secondly, it implies that London's flood defences might be overwhelmed in the relatively near future. But, you know, there's a lot of property and political prestige at stake here, as you can see from the buildings, the Houses of Parliament, the centre of political power in Britain. And so the engineers are onto this. And their assessment is that even at the upper end of projected sea level rises, the existing Thames barrier should be up to the job until the later part of the century at least. If it isn't, they can build a second one at Gravesend 20 kilometres down the river. Thirdly, and this I think is most significant, it's an image of helplessness that runs the risk of encouraging fatalism rather than action. By the way, in case you're wondering about this, which you'll see a lot of, it's an ice bow, and I took the picture of it. It's like a rainbow, but made of ice, it's somewhere north of the Arctic Circle in the Arctic Ocean. There's another respect in which I'd like to think that flood image is misguided, but I fear it may not be. And this is the assumption that people won't pay attention to climate change unless they see it as a disaster movie. If the world carries on the way it is, at the end of the century, global mean temperatures could well be 4 degrees higher. That would have catastrophic effects in many parts of the world, especially the poorer ones, which are also prone to drought and floods. But not here, though. If you were to glimpse a weather forecast for 2100, you might imagine that a century of climate change had turned out nice for Britain. And I should make it clear that what I'm saying is based on the thinking and the research I did for my book, Turned Out Nice, which is on this subject. And it's not the only possible future, but it seemed to me over the course of time I was working on it to be perhaps the best guess kind of future, given global climate change levels at the upper end of the projected scales. So in winter, it'll be mild throughout the land. In summer, in southern England, temperatures will reach levels that people currently fly 1,000 miles to enjoy. For most of the year, any given day in the north of England and Scotland is likely to be more agreeable than any given day in northern Britain now. Sure, the weather won't always be nice. The kind of winter floods that we now expect to happen once in a generation may become more like annual events. But in summer, water will be scarce, especially in the south. Fires, consequently, will be widespread. City summers will be long and unforgivingly hot. No matter how wealthy the country is, it won't escape disruption, damage, destruction, and expense. But climate change is about much more than the weather, and this is what I really want to talk about today. It implies changes in the social climate, the political climate, even the moral climate. It implies a profound alteration of relationships at all scales, from those between the nations of the world and between the nations of this one island, to those between individuals living in the same households. Britain is an ideal setting to consider just how deeply climate change might alter human relations, precisely because here we aren't dazzled by the possibility of terrible catastrophe. So this map of projected temperature rises, conveniently because of the scale that the colours chosen, paints the picture for us. The continent bakes, the British Isles stay pale. These islands will come into their own as the planet heats because they're Atlantic islands, buffered by the ocean currents from the extremes of continental climate. This happens already, of course. We have mild winters and cool summers with variations that never cease to obsess us. 1,000 miles to the east, summers are always hot and Christmas is always white. An ocean's worth of insulation will continue to protect the British Isles, even as deserts threaten to spread to the northern shores of the Mediterranean. The Isles will warm, but they'll warm less than almost anywhere else in the world. And by the way, if you're thinking, hang on, what about the Gulf Stream? What about the North Atlantic circulation being weakened by the processes of global warming? Yes, it's likely that this will have a cooling effect. If you wanted me to put a bet on it, I would still put my money on it merely offsetting it and Britain warming overall, but less than it would have done otherwise. And either way, it's consistent with my vision that the chief effect of climate change upon the British Isles will be to increase the distance between them and the rest of the world. They will become more attractive from the outside and draw people to them, though. Cool, green, misty lands will acquire a special aura as they become scarcer. Instead of palm-fringed golden beaches, international travellers will be lured by scenes like this, showing high summer in the Scottish Highlands, during one of my research trips, unless they zoom in to a degree of resolution that shows the mosquitoes. But anyway, British weather will become the envy of the world. Affluent people who can live where they choose will pay handsome premiums to live in some of the few remaining green and pleasant lands. They'll require large numbers of servants, cleaners and carers, as will the older people who will form much of the population. Those service workers will come from poor countries, made poorer and more precarious by drought or floods. Climate change will, in short, make Britain like it is today, only much more so. In some respects, it'll actually make urban Britain look more like the cities of the 19th century. Buildings will change shape under the triple pressure of space shortages, demand-inflated property prices, and the need to use energy in buildings and transport efficiently. They'll merge and huddle together. Suburbia will cease to look like this, like it did in the 20th century, each home a box on its own plot of land. If you remember school science, the rules about heat retention and loss, elephants retain heat better than mice do, so mice have to eat more. It's a question of the ratio of area to volume. And so the obvious way to conserve energy, no matter how modern your materials, you want to reduce that ratio. Obvious way to do that is to reduce the number of outside walls by joining the houses together. So suburbs in the 21st century will rediscover terraces, becoming more like the suburbs of the mid-19th century, such as Notting Hill or Islington. And indeed, given that these massive terraces with their very, very good insulating properties will turn out to be actually functionally pretty well adapted to climate change conditions later in this century, these may survive while buildings from the second half of the 20th century are demolished. But whatever people live in, nearly everyone will be living in places that are as densely packed as the more crowded parts of today's inner cities. So, people's day-to-day personal relationships will change as their ways of living with each other are altered. There are opportunities here. The convivial, communal use of limited but shared space. Ways of life and work that enable people to live neighbourly lives with their many neighbours. They may not have gardens of their own, but they could garden together. The buildings and streets they live in may well improve in physical and indeed organic quality. City roofs and walls covered with carpets of plants to absorb heat, and also the winter rain from the downpours that will become increasingly frequent. New materials will make clever use of light and heat. But people's real quality of life will depend on their ties with the people on the other side of the smart glass. They may choose to garden together, or they may stick with the popular current default option and put the job out to a contractor. Although the global effects of climate change will be radical, they may not hit the British Isles hard enough to jolt its nations and people into really radical thinking. So let's have another look at this heat map. What does it suggest about Britain's relationships with Europe and, by extension, with the rest of the world? A comfortable Britain, an overheated Europe. A Britain that will be gaining relative economic benefits because it's not having to pay as high a price as other countries to cope with climate change. And because its relatively comfortable position is attracting human and financial capital from elsewhere. A continent struggling in many regions. And just look at those regions that are going to be struggling. Yes, they're exactly the regions that are poorest now and struggling hardest in the face of current economic crisis. And parenthetically referring to what some of the speakers this morning, such as Paul Mason, said, perhaps those regions will be the laboratories of new forms of living, new forms of convivial, communal experience, that kind of gardening together that may provide for a genuinely rich quality of life in the future. Back to Britain again, a Britain that's utterly dependent on immigration and at the same time deeply ambivalent about it, whose fortunes depend entirely upon good relations with the rest of the world, but which is still tempted to think of itself as an island. It will be tempted to defect from Europe, deceiving itself that it's not part of the continent in every dimension other than the climatic. And it will thus risk the resentment, or worse, of the rest of the world. Britain built its prosperity by becoming the first country to base its economy on fossil fuels. Other countries, including the great powers of the future, like India and China, may well say, well, Britain got the benefits of burning carbon, now it can help pay its share of the bills. Within Britain, climate change, as I think you can make out on this map, will affect the south more than the north, and so it'll widen the north-south divide. The costs of coping with climate change will be higher in southern England, so it's easy to imagine people in the north saying, well, they've got the money down south, they can pay for it. Scotland's self of itself as a nation will come to include an awareness of itself as one of the few remaining cool green lands in the world. Whatever the nature of its relationship with England in the later part of the century, they will still be neighbours, but climate change is likely to be a factor drawing the two of them apart. The stress lines are all too easy to visualise because, as I said, climate change will make Britain like it is today, only more so. And the benefits will only be relative anyway. Like the rest of the world, Britain will be worse off than it would be if the climate stayed the same. Britain's not an economic island, and it won't be in the future. The Atlantic can't insulate it from whatever shocks climate change deals to the global economic system. It might be nice outside, but people aren't going to enjoy it much if they're worrying about their jobs, their pensions, or whether they'll find food on the shelves in the shops. And it'll be all the worse if they've drifted resentfully and unreflectively into their new conditions of life. If their reflexive response to the increasing density of settlement is to reach for their noise-cancelling headphones or whatever superior technologies of isolation have been developed by then. British people do have a tendency to take a pride in muddling through, in reacting to change rather than trying to impose a shape on it in advance. You could even say that it's part of who the British people are, in the same kind of way that some people argue that British national identity is based on not having a sense of national identity. But if you don't look the future in the face, or at least try to anticipate it, you risk throwing away most of your options and falling into a passivity trap, where it becomes all but impossible to escape from your situation through your own efforts. What we need above all in the face of change is a sense that, to at least some degree, We can act to change it, a sense of agency, a sense of being able to play a full part in our own lives. Agency requires engagement within and between communities, cities, nations, and international institutions. It requires the reinvention and enhancement of political networks, those flows of information and power between the street or the village and the capital or the state, in both directions, from the more powerful to the less powerful, and vice versa. It requires healthy, open, productive relationships at all scales, from the individual to the global, and between all those different scales. Now, agency and engagement offer us a way of understanding how we can be free in a world that can't afford to let people do as they please, regardless of the cost of the planet. At present, we're apt to buy into a simplistic, even juvenile notion of freedom, the kind that involves driving an SUV to the supermarket or taking 3 foreign holidays a year, even if we don't ourselves personally do those things. We need to grasp the idea of a subtler, sustainable kind of freedom, one which involves an increased ability to play a part in collective decisions, even though those decisions are increasingly constrained by threats of environmental crisis. In other words, we need to recognize freedom not in individual consumption, but in collaborative political action. This is not just the only kind of freedom that will be possible in the future. It's the kind of freedom the future needs right now. If we work out how to live together better today, we might just spare our children and grandchildren the need to work it out after the damage has been done. Thank you.